And the way this is going to work, the speakers on the platform are going to say some words in introduction for 5 minutes or so each. Then I'm going to encourage some conversation on the platform here, and then I'll open it out and get everybody involved. So, yes, I came back last night on a plane from Shanghai, so I am really fired up to speak about strident development and indeed aggressive growth. But here in the UK, the planning laws appear to want to trip up every form of development, either large or small. And whilst the government says that its intention is to liberalise those planning laws, it's open to question the extent to which that would have an impact on housing development, and indeed many will say it would be extremely undesirable to do so. So we're here to discuss that. With me I have Professor Kelvin Campbell, who's the owner of Smart Urbanism and is the author of Massive Small, the smart operating system for smart urbanism. Many of you may well be the member of Kelvin's website presence, which is an extremely large and influential discussion group about the future for urbanism in this country. Of course, many of you will also know Kelvin from his leadership of the consulting company Urban Initiatives for many years. Then Penny Lewis, the Master's Course Leader at Sutherland School of Architecture at the Robert Gordon University, and the co-founder of the AE Foundation. On my immediate left, Paul Miner, who's the Senior Planning Officer at the Campaign to Protect Rural England. Then Christine Murray, who is the editor of the Architects Journal. And then finally, on my far left, Daniel Moylan, who is the aviation advisor to the London Mayor and also a Conservative councillor at the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. So that's the panel. Yes, I'm going to keep a strict eye on time, but Kelvin, if you could make any points that you'd like to start us off.
Okay, just to start off, I'm in favour of to build. I think the debate is about to build or not to build. I'm just in favour of making sure we build it the right way. I also believe that what we've been doing recently is worked against the principle of good urbanism. So the concept of massive small is really about how do we release the collective power of lots of small things that happen to make a big difference.
So and then actually, just a bit louder, sorry.
Yeah, sure. Shall I move this over? Yeah. Right. That's probably a good.
Yes, thanks for that.
Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay. So the main principle is how does planning behave? How does planning change in a new bottom-up world? I think clearly it has to move from a command and control position, which has been occupying for years, into much more of an enabling position. And what we're talking about here is effectively how do we stimulate or accelerate house building at a time where we're building less housing than during the Second World War, and we were being bombed in the Second World War. So it's an interesting sort of dilemma about housing and housing delivery. I think the first thing is to move away from the concept of housing and talk about neighbourhoods rather. And I think we've been seeing housing as sort of a product design kind of exercise rather than something which is much more about building social capital and places. 3 stumbling blocks were identified by Professor Michael Ball. The first stumbling block to recovery was the planning system theory. The second was we're not achieving any economies of scale that come from replicability. And we have an incredible legacy of fantastic house building or fantastic neighbourhood building across the past couple of centuries. We kind of lost the sense of what that means. And I think the third one is steady release of land to a much wider market. Too much land goes through fairly strong competitive dialogue processes, ends up in 1 or 2, 3 major house builders' hands, and effectively it holds us to ransom because these projects never seem to happen. Now clearly there is an issue of finance, but the biggest issue for me is how do we achieve housing that's far more affordable rather than branding it affordable housing. And that actually means that we have to move to different systems, different ways of looking at how we deliver housing. There's been a lot of work that's taken place on low-density, high-family housing, a lot of high-density, low-family housing, but very little that's happened in that sweet spot of London, which is the medium-density, high-family house that probably most of us live in. Given all the legislation, there's something like 2,600 bits of legislation on the design of a house. Given all that legislation, three architects, some of the best architects, given slightly different briefs, come up with exactly the same products. And the same solutions to the way we do housing. So why don't we just take this and say, well, this represents a default condition for us. If it's good enough, why don't we define housing in terms of good typologies, good ways that we move forward. And that's always been a history of how we've done things. Housing has always been typologically based. So what we need is to try and define what I think is a choice architecture. In other words, a way in which we can make conscious choices about design, which enables us to choose the default if we want, or to choose to modify the default. And that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the default condition here today. I'm not talking about the special. And I recognise that there's always room for specials when we do places. But specials are only good when they're represented against the backdrop of the ordinary or the conventional or the normal. We've been working on the London Popular Home Initiative, which really looks at a way of looking at parameter housing or parameter-based housing to release the potential of planning briefs, building standards, and the use of enabling developers. And through that, we believe we can achieve fast-track planning, much more of an open building system, and open up wider market choice to a much wider group of people. The other thing we have to do is we have to break some of these large problem sites of ours into what I call problem molehills. And the only way we do that is to break them into bite-sized chunks. Too often a master plan just leads to another master plan, and yet another master plan. And we've often referred to the Rolodex as having 71 master plans. The reason is that we don't have any way of moving these things forward unless they're built, and therefore they just resort to the next level. So my plea is some sort of structure that enables us to break some of these bigger things into smaller elements that enable us to move forward. In planning, given all that legislation I mentioned, the 2,600 bits of regulation I mentioned, besides all the bits of guidance, we come up with looking at a large site, and the ultimate outcome of the planning process is a single outcome. In other words, through that whole process, in most instances, takes about a year for a planning scheme of about less than 20 houses, and can take up to 2 years for a planning scheme of greater than 20 houses. And that's the average that's being reflected at the moment. If we took a much more difficult approach around the use of parameter-based planning, we could achieve much more flexible outcomes. In other words, allowing the market to determine, allowing us to be much more flexible in the way in which we approach planning. We've been exploring the use of local development orders. There's no reason why, once you have a parameter book, there's no reason why you can't use local development orders, which basically permit development to happen. And this doesn't mean that it's anti-democratic. In fact, by controlling the parameter book, local authorities have much more control about the outcome, and therefore that's the way in which they can ease the way to the planning system. We're exploring the possibility of a guaranteed outcome of 13 weeks at the moment. That's what we're supposed to achieve, is 13 weeks. No one ever achieves 13 weeks. So we're looking at an outcome that guarantees 13 weeks, and working with 6 London boroughs, a number of large contractors and housing associations as well, to see if we can achieve this. Then the next main issue is, I suppose everyone recognises iPod as the sort of the successful thing that's created that enabled us to download music. But it wasn't Apple that achieved that, it was the MP3, the audio standard that achieved that. And we need that similar sort of standard in the building industry, something that achieves a standard that we can build on, a platform we can build on, that enables us to move forward. We don't have that because everything goes back to first principles. Someone referred to our house building industry as a cottage industry on steroids the other day. And it's to do with the roots and the understanding of where the house building industries come from. If we saw the house much more like a kitchen cabinet, a way in which we could assemble things, we could take advantage of what the Danish Building Institute showed recently, which is 40% of all the savings in housing comes from modular coordination, just simple modular standards that enable you to move forward on things. It doesn't mean everything is standard, it means that there's certain standards that exist within housing that enable us to move forward. The planned outcome we're looking for is something like 30% increased efficiency. Currently, we're 40 to 55% less efficient than the Swedish building industry. We're looking for a 20% savings in building costs. Currently, our housing is 40% more expensive than our competitors in mainland Europe. We're looking for a multiplier effect, a local economic multiplier effect, so we keep money in a community as well to make this happen. And then finally, on wider market choice, I'm concerned that the government policy on custom build will result in custom build or self-builders going out into the field somewhere and doing their things. And in fact, the strength of cities is when you have diversity. You really want the local guys to come into an area and work, and they're the ones that produce the unpredictability, make a place quite special. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Calvin. That's great. Okay, Annie.
Okay, like Mick, I've been in China, so forgive me if I'm a bit, sound like I'm on Prozac or something, so I feel like I'm slowing down at the moment. China's a good place to confront this question, to build or not to build, and it seems inevitable when you're in China that they should build, because there's a very clearly expressed demand. And then you draw comparisons with what is happening in Britain, and you feel much more ambiguous about the question of development. So as a result of that experience of going somewhere else where building seems to respond to a very clear social need, and returning to a country in which, staying in the City of London last night, you can see the spectacular possibilities of good building. I've just put together some slightly abstract thoughts on this question. Of course, yes, to build. The question is what to build and where to build is the question facing us in the UK at the moment. And I think one of the difficulties of addressing this issue, particularly for the discussion in architecture, is that there's often a real conflation and confusion of the difference between the question of identifying a need, which is a political and social question, and the imagination that goes into generating a practical solution to a problem, which is an architectural and an urbanistic issue. So if anything, that's my sort of theme for the day, if you like, that before we start to say this is a possibility of the way we might organise the production of new housing, or this is an ideal urbanistic form through which we can deliver mixed-use housing, I think we need to be a bit mature and reflect upon the different kinds of issues that are thrown up within the political and social sphere and through the realm of design, because they're two different things. Take the housing question, for example. So this is not a new thing within the political sphere. Engels writes about the housing question in the 1880s. And you can see at that point he's very clearly identifying an urbanistic and social dynamic which throws out the need for an entirely new attitude towards the provision of homes for the working class. 100 years later, we're posed with the same problem, a housing question, but at that point you can see that the question of the delivery of housing is now entirely integrated into the workings of financial capital within the British economy, and so it becomes incredibly complicated. So you can't really think about the housing question as an abstract design question. There needs to be a sort of prior understanding of the relationship between the production of housing and the social and economic framework in which it sits. That said, understanding the context and understanding the mechanisms and the forces that act in order to determine what we produce for housing and how we produce it, that understanding needs to be something that's separated. One of the things I really love about architects is that they can be incredibly naive. So they can put forward a proposition of how we might live and how we might resolve the very real housing issue today in the southeast of England, and it can bear very little relationship to the social and political context. And that can be a very useful and positive thing that they make that separation, I think, because they are imagining the possibility of delivering something that people need without recourse to the constraints that we know that exist in terms of the procurement process and the financing and rents and everything else that exists within the question of housing. So while I'm keen that discussions separate the social, political and architectural, I'm also keen that in a way architecture and urbanism has a certain autonomy from those things. It understands them and it can also operate and imagine something that's different from the constraints posed by the economic situation. Okay, so that's my first point. I'll call one other point. So it's good to dream about the possibility of something different, and I think that's what the architectural profession in particular brings to this discussion, more I would say than urbanists, if you like, because they tend to be tied more into the political framework. And sometimes they come nowhere close to delivering what's imagined as an ideal situation. But often the best work that's produced in Britain at the moment has a kernel of the idea of what might be the appropriate way to produce housing, which I think is a very positive thing. And students and young architects and designers should be encouraged to engage in things at that level. The danger, of course, is that through imagining how we might live, and an idealised version of how we might live, that we overstate the possibility of using design and using urbanism as a way of changing the very nature and core of our social relations. So this is my second point, if you like, is that in the process of thinking about should we build, what should we build, where should we build, I think that there's a problem entered into the dialogue where we overstate the case of what can be achieved through urban strategies and through urban design. A sense of place, a sense of community, a sense of identity, a sense of historical continuity. All of these issues, it is claimed, can be resolved by architects and urban designers and planners. And I think that's a real problem for us at the moment, that this idea that somehow through bricks and mortar we can reconstruct a social world. So yes, I think we should build to meet a need, and yes, I think we should engage in an imaginary discussion about what would be the ideal. But no, I don't think that we should imagine that this process can actually be a substitute for the construction of real normal social relations in society, just by building a public space, just by introducing a mixed-use development, just by organising blind rental and tenancy systems. We do not resolve the problems of social dislocation and alienation in contemporary society. Andrea Branzi, the Italian neo-rationalist, talked about dismissal. He said, actually, it's a weird thing at the moment because we live in a weak modernity, and in this weak modernity, you see that we are living in places where we used to work, and we're working in places where we used to live, and actually the formation of the city is a pretty arbitrary process that's taking place in which everything that we have left in the city, the existing fabric of the city, is a problem because it doesn't actually meet contemporary needs and contemporary programs, and therefore we should have a very liberal attitude towards planning regulations. We should just imagine great big new structures and great big new ideas about how we might build and remake the city. And at the very same time that he was doing this, and I presume we're around in Super Studio, etc., okay, Aldo Rossi argued for continuity. Both of those issues are relevant today, and I think what I like to talk about within the profession as a whole is how we address both of those issues.
Thanks, Andy. Okay, Paul.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to argue that we should plan and then build what we need to a high standard, and respecting that our irreplaceable countryside is a legitimate constraint on building just anywhere. Our landscape and historic townscape are one of the main reasons why people want to come to this country and live and invest here. And you'll see from the work of Richard Florida in particular that that's a pattern across the world. It's a big influence on how people make investment decisions. So careful planning will reinforce the beauty of England and Britain and will encourage economic growth at the same time. Indiscriminate, poorly planned building will destroy that. There are some myths about planning. One is that it's notoriously stringent. In fact, if you look at the statistics, most planning applications are actually approved. The consistent rates are over 80-90% each year, and that relates to tens of thousands of applications that are approved each year. I don't disagree that there's a need for sensible reform. And I think many of the points that Kelvin talked about are well worth investigating. We should be looking at these timescales for applications. We should be looking at the amount of information that's being submitted for planning applications. There are sensible changes that can be made. But most planning applications are and should be decided locally. I don't know if any of you have seen the government's infrastructure bill that was published in the past week, but we're concerned that will actually take things too far in the wrong direction. If you look at one of the leading clauses, in particular on allowing the developers to apply directly to the Secretary of State for some forms of development, how are you going to make that clause work? You need to recruit more quangocrats, more planning inspectors, you need to hold more public inquiries. Is this really what the government wants when it's talking about tackling the deficit? And a couple of people before me mentioned China. I don't want a Chinese planning system, thank you very much. The planning system that we have is hugely valuable. It gets the development that we need in most cases. It's not perfect, but I think that's the planning system that's nearest what we need than the kind of system that's operating at the moment in China. What should we build? It's important to remember at this point that I'm going to talk mainly about housing here. Other speakers will talk about different subjects, but overall in this country we actually have more homes than households in this country, and also most of the homes that we have in this country are actually have more space in them than the European average. There have been problems more recently with some of the quality of some of the newer housing that's being built, but we don't need to follow the example of Ireland or Spain and just cover the countryside in concrete. We do need more affordable housing, as Kelvin again has rightly pointed out. And it's also important that it's energy efficient housing, and also we do need housing in particular for people to live in and adapt to and grow. So that's housing that should be able to accommodate families. But also we do have overall an ageing population in this country, and it has been pointed out that much of our existing housing, that there's a lot of space in it going to waste. We need to link housing to jobs. And so, in effect, we do need it to be properly planned. The government's talking about new garden cities. I think I would be very disappointed if we were to build new cities that look like Welling or Letchworth, as good as they were in their time. But we've moved on a lot since then. We need to think about things like making homes zero carbon. We need proper transport systems. We need generally links to railways where possible, but also people need to be encouraged to walk and cycle more, so we're dealing with the wider problem of obesity at the same time. And we should also make valuable use of our countryside. When we built Welling and Letchworth, we weren't worrying about global population growth and climate change to the same degree that we are now. So if we are going to build new housing in this country, it does have to make good use of land. And so that's why we would recommend that things like the typical Victorian or Edwardian terrace, the Edwardian period in particular, is a good model to start from. We're not saying we should build pastiche of what went before, but if you look at places like New Islington in Manchester, or some of the new housing that's being built in Barking or Camberwell or Lewisham in London, those are well-designed homes which have front and back gardens, but also have good access to public transport and make good use of land overall. And it's important that they are in the right place. And let's be clear here, we still have plenty of brownfield land available in this country, at the last count for over 1.5 million new homes. And so when we're looking to build, we should build brownfield sites first. When we do need greenfield sites, we should make sure that important planning protections like the green belts and areas like saying natural beauty are respected. The green belt is a hugely valuable resource for London and all our other major towns and cities. It's got higher than average levels of woodland cover, higher than average levels of local nature reserves, and there's also a great deal of public access to the green belt as well, much more, again, than people perhaps realise. So to conclude, we shouldn't just build because we haven't got any better ideas or how to stimulate the economy. The economic growth is going to need a wider response than just encouraging more building. We've seen the consequences in Ireland and Spain and in Greece too. What can happen with just indiscriminate building? We should build the housing that we need. We should have smart growth. And we should also build in the right places.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, Christine, your thoughts?
Okay. So, as previously mentioned, this year is the year that the least number of homes will be built.
Can you speak up?
Sure, sorry. Should I just turn this? Is that better? Okay. So, as mentioned, this year is the year that the least number of homes will have been built since the Second World War. Nevertheless, developers are actually sitting on massive land banks, not because they can't win planning permission for homes, because they already have planning permission for homes. They sit on them without developing them because sitting on the land is actually more lucrative than building and selling the homes. Large-scale housing developers are currently manipulating the housing market by buying up large amounts of prime land and not building because profitability is low. The current housing shortage is a deliberate reduction in supply and that is to artificially boost house prices. And this is by increasing demand. The number of young people desperate and unable to get on the housing ladder are a captive future market. So while the banks have adopted tighter mortgage conditions, and there's a recession and high unemployment rates, it's a toxic mix. This suggests the problem isn't with the planning system. These developers have already won the right to build. The problem is with the economy, and with the expectation that big business will do house building even when the most profit is to be made by doing nothing at all. So planning is a red herring. Yes, build, but building isn't happening. So no matter how relaxed planning becomes, developers will still sit on land that is gaining in value without developing. Building is expensive. Why invest in a property if its value will go up regardless? House prices are low, but will rise due to shortages as they are in central London. So developers won't build any new homes until the economy improves, mortgage lending increases, or house prices rise due to demand and short supply. So the frantic attempts to encourage building by relaxing planning rules simply exacerbates the current state of affairs. In the meantime, the lower cost of building is being lost out on by the government who could be building themselves. So given the current state of the economy, if we'd like to encourage house building, the government either needs to build housing itself, tax the land being held by developers without developing to make sitting on land less attractive, or dramatically increase the amount of land up for development, which will drive down the value of land. So I wouldn't recommend increasing the supply of land, because the economy and the environment benefits from high-density development, which is the hardest to incentivize developers to build. It's expensive and tricky to develop brownfield or inner-city sites. The planning overlooking neighboring issues are much greater, the access is trickier, and that's a more expensive build cost. So developers will only develop inner-city sites or demolish or refurbish if there are not easier places to build, and an easy place to build is in the greenbelt. Taxing idle land is quite a good idea, but the current administration is unlikely to consider it. But if developers faced a rising penalty the longer they sat on land without developing, they would be forced to build. The third option, which is the government becoming a developer itself. The sell-off of the school playing fields is an interesting example of mismanagement in this case. Most of these sites will be bought by developers who will win planning permission to develop them, and then sit on the land or sell it off with planning permission, having increased its value. So assuming the school fields should not have been retained for school use, the government could have commissioned an architect to design a development for the site, which included whatever units it wanted, affordable, housing, etc., and given itself planning permission for that site. Then it could have tendered the site to contractor development partners under the conditions that the plans were carried out within a specific time limit and developed under their specifications. If that sounds farcical, some local authorities have done just that. Brent Council gave itself planning permission for a scheme that developed with an architect and tendered it, and the housing has been built to its specifications and recently completed. Other schemes, such as Clapham 1, developed by Cathedral, have adopted a clever partnership. In a PPP success story, Lambeth gave Cathedral the land to develop. They developed a block of luxury flats, but they also built a library, medical centre, leisure centre, and affordable units free of charge for Lambeth. On the one hand, localism should enable this kind of visionary planning and deal-making, but cash-strapped, staff-poor and time-poor councils often don't realize the power they currently wield. They use planning as a style-making process, enforcing the shape of the building or the color of its roof, rather than ensuring that the public benefits from private profit-making in their area. So not less planning, but visionary planning. I have no objections to the cutting of red tape, but it must be replaced with intelligence. The trouble with the NPPF is that it's simply a framework, and it doesn't give a strong vision. Both the government and the majority of local authorities are being outsmarted by developers. They need to learn from big business and make the most out of the assets and the negotiating powers that they have. Take airports, for example. 3 different plans for 3 different London airports are being speculatively drawn up by 3 different architects. But the government itself has deferred its decision on what to do about airport capacity until 2015. The trouble isn't a surplus of planning red tape, but a lack of vision and a lack of a plan.
Okay, thank you very much, Christine. Daniel, over to you.
Well, I don't know if I've got a lot to contribute to this. I didn't understand some of the earlier contributions. I did understand Christine's contribution and disagreed with nearly all of it, which has slightly put me off my stride because I didn't know whether to deal with what she said or say what I was going to say in the first place. But I do think we need to start just to deal with one point about Christine. We need to understand that we actually live in what is still, notionally at least, a free country, which has private property, and where private property is the norm, and where we protect private property. So the notion that seems to be shared by nearly all the speakers so far, that the predominant role in deciding what cities look like and what is to be provided in the future is actually to be taken by a relatively small group of people operating inside government, some planners, some others, and so forth, and that we doesn't, by the way, mean us, it means that group, that we decide what we need, we decide how to provide for it, and we deliver it, with no regard for the rights of private property, including the rights of private property, incidentally, of developers who may have sensibly bought land at low prices so that they have something to build on in the future, just to expect any other business to try and secure its supplies in advance. That seems to me a very dangerous one. There's also, I think, a lack in the debate so far of a recognition of the enormous scale of the challenges facing us. We discovered in London, and most of my comments will be a little bit London-centric simply because I work in London government, so forgive that, but we discovered in London a few months ago that the population was probably 500,000 higher than we thought it was before. So we just add 500,000 people to the list that we didn't even know we had. We know that it is very likely that the population of London is going to rise considerably in the future, in the relatively near future. And that's largely, incidentally, through natural increase of birth rather than projections of assumed immigration, whether national immigration or international immigration. It's to do with the demographic profile of the city. We probably need, at least in the short term, at least 500,000 new homes in London, just to keep where we are. We have a distorted market. We have a market where there is a relatively free market for privately owned homes. That is, if you own a home, it is relatively straightforward to sell it to somebody and you will achieve the market price, roughly speaking, if you're willing to wait and so on. It is a relatively free market. There's no market at all, really, in what is known as affordable housing, and that is a stock that has a very large part of the housing stock in London, and simply sits there completely unexposed to market forces. But the part of the market that's most missing is a sort of assumption that new build in London is driven by market forces, whereas in fact, having been on the inside of planning in Kensington and Chelsea for some years, I can assure you it is not, and that there is almost no market-driven activity going on at all. It's a deal, it's a deal cut between planning authorities and the owners and developers of lands, whereby, irrespective of market forces, the goods, the produce of that land, when developed, is basically shared between the developer, who's allowed to keep a certain margin, normally 20%. So they're not worried, they get their return, and the rest is largely taken through viability tests and so forth for the benefit of government in one form or another. And there's no market in that at all. So we have 500,000 homes we need and serious problems there. We need the schools and the hospitals that will go with the population increase that we're looking at, quite apart from the transport systems. And I can certainly tell you some of the things we need in order to simply get, in transport terms, in order in London simply to get those people from their homes to where they're going to work, because they will need jobs. We have, and we largely don't talk about this very much nationally, but certainly also in London, a very severe and growing shortage of electricity. And we desperately need new power stations and new means of generating electricity. and that is definitely also leading us into an area I'm actually quite neutral on, which is the form of that electricity generation and whether it should be nuclear or not. As I say, I'm not building into that, and I don't have a very strong view. But we have to confront that nuclear question if we're to address the issue of how we're going to generate the electricity that we need. We definitely need a new airport, and we have been avoiding making a decision about our need for a new airport for at least, well, since 1974, basically, because the Heath government in 1974 did actually pass an act of Parliament to allow a new airport to be built at Batley. So I suppose that was decisive. That was the last time we saw decisiveness. Of course, the project was cancelled immediately by the ensuing government pretty well after the Heath government fell. So nothing was actually done. But I suppose that is the last example of something decisive actually being done and delivered. That's a small example of some of the things we need. And then what is it that we have, what are the tools that we have to address these problems? Or what are the tools we try to use? The first is we have no money. And I don't mean to say simply the government has no money. I mean the banks have no money. And I was touched to hear a reference to the, I thought, largely forgotten figure of Friedrich Engels earlier in the discussion. And the suggestion that in 1880, Engels was writing without the benefit of financial capitalism, whereas by 1980, 100 years later, the whole thing became much more complicated in that respect. Now, in fact, of course, if you look at the survey of London, practically the whole of central London was built out on mortgages by small builders, in fact, almost entirely in the same way that building takes place at the moment. And they were very often, there was an entire mortgage industry in the 19th century available to developers precisely for this sort of purpose. Nothing very much has changed in that regard. We have a host of restrictions. We have sites of special this, areas of special that. We have the green belt. I think the green belt has a value, not in protecting the countryside. I don't think there's very much reason to protect the countryside myself, but rather in protecting the city from shambolic growth, because the cities do need to have certain levels of density in order to be effective as cities. And finally, we have the Town and Country Planning Act, the last relic of Stalinist notions of government. And you must remember all the other planning we had in the immediate post-war era. We had planned transport systems. Freight was nationalised. All sorts of things were going to be planned. They were gradually dismantled out there. They were gradually dismantled. But what we did not dismantle, and what we've not thought about looking at really afresh, is actually dismantling the Town and Country Planning Act and thinking perhaps how other countries have done it. It was a brilliant piece of legislation in its drafting, and that is why it has been copied, and that in other countries, and why it has lasted so very, very long. I'm absolutely willing to say that. But in fact, I think its time is past, and we should be looking at the whole thing afresh. And to that extent, I'm disappointed that the government is merely suggesting, yet again, a small tinkering with it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So okay, I just want to give the people on the panel an opportunity to react to what other people have said. And I suppose, I'm hearing actually some profound disagreements amongst colleagues on the panel, and I would like you to say whatever you want to in response to anything that's been said so far. But specifically, and in order to kind of help us kind of understand exactly where you're coming from, try and point really simply to anything that you strongly disagree with that other people have said. So just to kind of help us to kind of, if you like, clarify the issues so far. Kelvin, but anything you want to say?
I think probably a slight agreement. We can speak at the end of the table. The 1947 Town and Country Planning Act was based on two utopian systems, one which was modernism, modern city planning, the other was the Garden City movement. And both of them believed that you could control everything, believed that you have absolute control over the outcome of every single decision that you could make around cities. And cities are far too complex to be managed in that way. So I think deep down the flaw in the system is not so much the fact that we have a system, but that the roots of it believe that we could predict and plan everything. And that's quite a difficult outcome. I think the second point, I think picking up what Penny mentioned, is the fact that we are using instruments like master plans to try and determine outcomes of 15 to 20 years. The day the ink dries on the plan, it's out of date. The fantastic saying by Mike Tyson is that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And it's true, a plan is out of date the day that you try and write. So why do we have these instruments? Why do we believe that we can predict and plan everything? And therefore, why do we rather look at what we need to do now to make cities much more effective? And that probably means that we need to move away from command and control to much more enabling leadership. And that has an implication on how we control things. It has an implication on the legal system, on the planning system. It's an incredibly complex set of issues. But the fact is that the crisis wasn't created by the credit crisis. The crisis was there long before we started. It's been deep in the system for a good 20, 25 years now.
Okay, thanks. Penny?
I mean, surprisingly, you might find that I agree with the idea that we should liberalise the planning system. Reference to Frederick Engels was not a systematic outlook which suggested a support for everything that had happened in terms of post-war Britain. I was making the point that Engels tried to understand a particular set of social conditions, and I think that our particular set of social conditions were explained extremely well by Christine in terms of outlining what the economic restraints are on the production of new houses now. And I mean, that's the difficulty, isn't it? It's sort of, we can have a discussion about what we would like to happen, but in our heart of hearts we know that there's a whole set of forces operating that are way beyond our control, and we can sort of push and sort of suggest certain ways in which procurement could be changed, in which the housing crisis could be alleviated. But the reality is that we expect the private sector to deliver these things, and even they, with the best will in the world, can't control the environment in which they operate. So in terms of what I think we do need, and I would agree with this point at the end, I think we do need to liberalise the planning system. It has become a mechanism for development and control. It is not about planning, and we need to encourage the politicians to be more strategic and ambitious in their plans for infrastructure. And if we could have a more ambitious attitude towards infrastructure and a more liberal attitude towards development, I think that would be a very positive thing.
Okay, Paul, there is a risk here, isn't there, of us all kind of racing to agree, and yet there are some real kind of deep-seated differences of opinion here. The government should build, the government shouldn't. We need to deregulate the planning system. We don't. We need to kind of get under these things, I think, and to draw out some of the differences in order that we can discuss them effectively. But Paul, any comments on anything that anybody said, but please do kind of help us kind of draw out some of the differences.
Thanks, Michael. Just to make sure you can hear me. We'll continue to get planning reform. It's surprising that in probably the past 10 years we've seen more changes to the planning system than we had in probably the previous 40 or 50. And again, the sensible reforms can always be made, but I think going back to Daniel's point about doing that market decide more, I think it's always going to be difficult to really work out how much influence markets purely having, but if you look at what's been happening in America over the past 40, 50 years, the sheer amount of urban sprawl that's been happening there, because the planning system there has been much less regulated. It's led to huge losses of farmland, large areas of the country, large suburbs where people are just completely dependent on cars to get around. And I think the planning system in this country has always been a mixture, I think as Daniel's right pointed out, between what local authorities want and what developers want. But there's always going to be a compromise between them. But I think we can and should be insisting on the best quality of development. If you look at countries such as Germany, for example, which is probably the strongest economy in Europe over the past 10 or so years, they have a very strong planning system. And it hasn't stopped them delivering the new homes they need, and it hasn't stopped them delivering very good quality new housing. For example, if you look at places like Freiburg, for example, the new extension to that system that they built.
Christine, sorry, Christine.
What to add? I'm always heartened when
Did
people...
you disagree with anybody? Did you think anybody said that you strongly disagree with?
I like being strongly disagreed with, so that was good. Did I strongly disagree with anything?
Do you want to
I think-
deregulate the planning system?
I don't have a problem with less red tape, but I do have a problem with a lack of ambition, which I think Penny mentioned. I think sometimes privatization, or depending on the private sector, can make sense, but I think sometimes it's just indicative of a kind of laziness or lack of ambition, lack of vision, also a kind of political scapegoating, because then if the private sector doesn't do it right, you can't blame the government for it. I think that's probably where I sit in terms of, that's probably where the fundamental disagreement lies, is that I think the private sector is obviously ruled by the need to make a profit every year, indefinitely, and a greater one, and you can't rely on them to necessarily make long-term visionary decisions.
Daniel, anything you'd like to respond to at this point, or indeed Dan?
Well, having the last speaker, I got my attacks in early, so I'm not sure that I've got very much to add on that front. I am heartened that most of the speakers actually call for more ambition. There is clearly a role for government in providing and facilitating, at least, a certain amount of necessary infrastructure in order for us all to be able to do what we want to do. But I do think it's worth remembering and really looking at, and I chastise the academic world for not wanting to look at this, the fact that so much of our infrastructure that we rely on today was actually built by the private sector and private money. That includes the railways that we rely on, it includes the London Underground, which is almost entirely built by private money, not the farther extensions into the countryside, countryside, but certainly most of the core network was all built by private money. We call it money laundering nowadays, because we don't know where it actually came from, and what's wrong with that. And so on, and why, it seems to me that there are opportunities for understanding why that worked then, and why it doesn't work now, but people don't seem to want to analyse that, or work out what has changed that makes that so different. We make the building of infrastructure extremely expensive by various means, and again, we need to understand why that is.
Okay, thank you. All right, folks, it's now your opportunity. Yes, yes, go back there.
Oh, wait for the microphone. To build or not to build, there was a really interesting show a couple of years ago on telly called The Secret Life of the Motorway. I don't know if anyone saw it, but it was looked at the evolution of the motorways and the planning challenges that they faced. The final episode was on protests, and as part of that they talked to a couple who had protested successfully against a bypass in Vauxhall in the 70s on the basis that they wanted to preserve the neighbourhood for future generations. And it asked them in the end what they thought of their legacy, and they said, well, look around, and what it showed was them and the main road full of cars going nowhere, and I thought, thanks. But to me that was a really good illustration of how sometimes views against, arguing against bold development are often couched in long-term thinking, but are actually really quite short-term in thinking about human quality of life and the unimaginative in terms of how things could be better.
Okay, gentleman in front of you.
Just a couple of figures. Built-up areas of built-up areas and gardens in the last Centre for Ecology and Hydrology land survey, which is fairly authoritative, is 8.9% of the land area. 10% of UK of English land is actually restricted from any kind of development by being areas of outstanding natural beauty or national parks. Now, we have to stop pretending that we live in a country which is overrun with urban sprawl, right? 52 million people in England live on 8.9% of the land. For the population to double, it would still only mean that less than 20% of the land area would be built up, right? So I think, although it's very nice and pleasant to have a debate which seems to think that there's probably a good reason to have more building, first of all, there is simply no case for having a complicated argument about the lease of land. Quite simple. We should get on with, and this is in the context of what is effectively becoming a crisis of urban space, right? So, land or population density in England has risen over the last 10 years. Yeah, it's something like 240 people per square kilometres, now going up to 258. It's obvious that there is a serious problem, and talking about the niceties of design, good urban planning, and so on, is a complete conceit. And one of the problems is that it's always the case that people who are in charge, people who think they're experts, always seem to think that it's their business to solve the problem. In fact, the problem would be largely solved if people in local government, even all the various kind of extensions of regulation, legislation, policy, would just get out of the way of ordinary people to buy land and build on it. And that's quite simple. So I'd like to know whether the panel are equivocal about releasing land and building on it or not.
Okay, James? Next to you on the right.
Oh, I suppose I'm going to say something similar, but I feel that there's something, kind of bad faith in the planning profession. Having been writing and arguing about the shortage of homes for, 12 years now, and I can tell you that whenever it's raised, it was invariably the case that, as it was, for example, in the Barker Review, when John Prescott was making his speech in 2005, when we were talking about Gordon in 2003, when Gordon Brown was talking about eco-towns, to a man and woman, planners got up and said, we really don't need these new homes. And they said over and over again to me and to everybody who would listen, there is no shortage of houses, there are empty houses, they would say, pointing to some derelict shack over there. And there is no problem with the planning system, it's working fine. And now we are down the line, some 12 years, and there is an absolute shortage of homes for people to live in. And that is why in Newham now, people are living in garden sheds that have been converted, why the local authorities are going around looking at over-occupied houses and amazingly knocking them down. And over again, we see the same kind of mantra that this entirely fictitious green England that simply doesn't exist because none of us ever spend any time there, as you can tell, must be protected against what? Us, God forbid. That people have the absolute nerve to call us, human beings, sprawl. When you say, I'm going to home people, I'm going to give them places to live, you could dare to say with the contempt dripping from your voice that that is sprawl. All of London is sprawl. Every city in the world is sprawl. Every inner city began its life as a suburb. You don't house people without building houses. And it's just absolutely wrong and malevolent and wicked to say that the problem is developers sitting on land. It's completely fictitious because there would be no possibility of developers sitting on land if the planning system itself were not so onerous that only the very large developers were able to bid for and to take control of those large land banks. If ordinary small developers were able to compete, if they didn't have to spend millions on lawyers to get the planning permission, then those land banks wouldn't be worth anything because people would be able to build where they could. That is the problem.
Okay, let's just take some quick kind of responses to those points from the panel and then I'll go out again.
I can't agree with you more. The fact is that most of our land, most of our large sites are tied up, as Christine said, in the hands of few people who are not building. You're seeing the largest developer in London only building 200 houses a year, but we need 32,000. That's on one particular site. So I think there's an issue there, and it comes back to the instruments we're using. Greenbelt policy was set up with good intentions, but it's actually worked against the principle of good urbanism. The greenbelt should be managed exactly the same way as the city should be managed. We should look at limits of growth, to look at expansion. The idea that to build on a brownfield site only is an absolute anathema for me. What makes us think we can go and build on a former airfield site in Oxfordshire Village, we call it an eco-town, and call it sustainable? Then we should be turning those sites back into greenland and looking at our expansion of our city in a creative way around infrastructure. We should be looking at public transport, setting up the networks, and from that, defining the growth of our cities, like most other good cities plan themselves. So we're using the wrong instruments all the time. Once again, with good intentions, but with incredibly bad outcomes.
Yeah, I don't disagree with what James is saying. I think, though, that then there's a danger in that discussion that you get caught up in this idea of dispersal is better than density, and the people that sort of just want to stick with the planning system are in favour of denser development, and the people that want to eradicate a lot of the regulations of the planning system are in favour of dispersal. And I think, again, there's a danger that we sort of end up in a design discussion where the key question is the political question of the regulations. And I don't disagree with what you're saying about sprawl, but I think there's a prior problem, which is that if you are going to extend development in the countryside, then there does need to be a level of investment from the state in order to make that feasible and manageable. And that's the same problem that you've got in Britain as you've got in China. And the Chinese have the resources to do these things. I'm not saying they're perfect, but they have the resources, and it becomes really the capacity of the state to finance the framework for development in that situation, which becomes the critical question.
Okay, Paul?
Thank you. Yeah, some interesting points there. We agree certainly that there has been a problem that's arisen in recent years through the large house builders controlling the release of land, and they've been doing it more and more. The figures that we put out show that leading house builders become almost, some might say, a cartel recently is controlling the release of land. But I think we would diverge quite significantly on the solutions to that problem. I think a couple of points I'd make is that you mentioned the point about 8.9% of the land area, whatever is built on. That may be the case, but I think it does need to be put into context. In particular, I just wondered if you knew how much of London was built on, for example.
How do you mean?
Well, how much of London is considered as urban or built on?
Well, that's the 50% actually.
It doesn't matter. I mean,
That's
the point is,
of London.
well, just to be clear, I don't care, but the fact is, it's getting, listen, it's getting denser, so that's what you should care about. The point is, London is becoming more dense. That means more people are living in less space, and that's what one should care about.
Let's kind of, just let me do an order thing. So in order to kind of keep it going, rather than beginning the conversation, kind of make your points and then I can bring the others in. And I'm more than happy for people to come back again. Sorry.
I think there was one other point I wanted to make about the motorway process, and I think it's important to recognise when we're talking about the planning system generally, is that it's, in this country, is that democracy is an important part of how the planning system in this country works. And what had happened up until the 1970s was that you did have a small cabal of experts actually saying we need new roads here, there and everywhere. And it got to the point in the 1970s where people were saying, no, it is actually having major effects on the places we love, the places we want to keep protected. And to give an example from Far Eastern country, Korea, which I visited a few years ago, they had a massive four-lane motorway in the centre of Seoul, which they actually ripped up, and they actually turned it into a lovely blue river garden. And it's well worth visiting if you've ever been or get a chance to go. And I think that actually shows that if we'd gone down that road in this country, we'd have had to probably pay an absolute fortune to rip all these new shiny motorways in the centre of London up and restore them to what they are now.
Christine?
I think I'm hearing that investment in infrastructure is being key to developing anywhere and encouraging. And that tends to come from, I think this point about it being private section built, private money that was used to build infrastructure is an interesting one. I think the idea, I think what I'm often interested in is, a solution that causes some kind of short-term reaction And I'm not sure we've come on the panel to something that we could, go away and someone could feasibly do that would begin on the road to fixing that. So I think, I don't know, that's not really a point, but I guess it's just a frustration, again, with this same one coming here where there's a lot of theory, but what will actually get building happening.
Well, feel free then to kind of...
Yeah, well, I'm not convinced. I do think that relaxing planning, I'm not convinced that would actually cause these kind of smaller developers. I'm not sure the land is there that's getting picked up. I'm not convinced that that any of us have come up with an idea that tomorrow will cause building to start happening again.
Okay, Daniel?
Well, I thought I was a little bit radical, but the three speakers we've had so far have been much more radical than me. Tear it all up, start keep building, release more land, and get the green belt, and so on. So that's good. And probably there's a lot to be said for what's just been set out. I think we do, however, have to recognise, not just, as I said earlier, the scale of the challenge we face, but also the scale of our failure to date. Because while it's true that we have devised a system which protects, if that's the right word, rural England, and which makes it extremely difficult to build any new piece of infrastructure unless it is a government project, unless the government is behind it. We've done all of that, and the result is that we have a severe housing shortage, we don't have enough electricity, we don't have enough aviation capacity, and we see no means of resolving it. So I do think that some radical solutions are required.
Okay, can I see who wants to speak? At the back.
Nico MacDonald, I'm the co-author of Big Potatoes, the London Manifesto for Innovation. One term we haven't heard very much in this discussion is innovation. I think Penny alluded to it when she talked about standardisation of components for housing and building and so on, which I think is a very interesting development, that you can download the spec for something and install it and add it to an electronic design and so on. She also alluded to a change which is taking place as a result of information communication technology, which is the changing use of workspaces to urban spaces and vice versa, which is having a profound effect. And I'd be interested to hear more about what we can do today, we couldn't do when the Barbican was built and other large developments, around innovation and particularly information and communication technology. What potential do we have in, what do we need to design? How do we plan? How do we construct? And how do we live and work in those spaces? It seems to me there's huge potential which is untapped. We can use technology in a humane and ambitious and visionary way.
Okay, the back. That's, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we could have 3D printers printing modules of different parts of homes or complete homes. I think that's good. And if anyone doesn't believe that there is a need, there's a manufacturer of chicken coops in Yorkshire that is selling more chicken coops to London than houses are being built in London at the moment. So, and the chicken coops are not been holding chickens; they're being put in back gardens for people to live in. And so there is a need, undoubtedly. And I think that there's been, the talk of planning, at the beginning it sort of came across to me a bit like a parliamentary committee, some of those that I've been to in the past, that the misuse of the term planning, it wasn't until people started talking about creative planning and innovation and infrastructure and how to achieve that I felt the discussion moved on a bit. Planning is so often seen as get the planners off our backs, as David Cameron says, and it's just regulation. And to that extent, if I was a developer, I've been a planner all my life. I've been fighting and negotiating with shyster developers all my life. But I have to defend them to the extent that to build is extremely difficult at the moment, even for the biggest volume house build. to open a site in a city, in a town, you have to comply with over 26 pieces of primary environmental legislation. And you need handbooks this thick to print them out. Let alone, that's after you've got the planning permissions with all conditions and after you've paid off all the third parties and so on. So you know, I've got some sympathy for entrepreneurs and developers actually. And I want to move on from that to the point that, well, no one's used the term freeholder. We used to be freeholders. Owners of property and land used to be able to pretty much do what they wanted. And they negotiated with each other when they wanted to develop their land. And that negotiation was either cooperative or it was collaborative, or it was confrontational and you went to law or you fought them off or whatever. Now it's all litigious, the lawyers, the Town and Country Planning Act, the rights to develop were nationalised. That took that constraint, put a constraint on freeholders to basically say you don't own your land anymore, you don't own the right to develop. And from that point on, the successive Town and Country Planning Acts meant that environmentalists, campaign groups, amenity societies all have claims on the right to develop your land and tell you how you should do it. Town councils, parish councils and so on, now localism and so on. But they're all telling you how to develop your land. And I've got some, and the reason I'm putting it in this way is that actually, you know, there's this sort of freedom that's been lost there somewhere along the line. There's a sort of freedom to develop that we lost somewhere along the line in the 20th century, which must be around particularly the time of the Town and Country Planning Act and the need for the state to take over the building of infrastructure and housing. And now that developers are finding it extremely difficult to develop, well, we've got to remember that it's not the first time in history. From 1939 to 1984, no private housing was built in London between 1939 and 1984. And so, you know, we've had periods before when the state has had to intervene, and if we need to demand that, let's demand it.
Okay, yeah, in front. Yeah, you're next.
You're next. No, I just wanted to pick up on something Penny mentioned earlier on, which is this thing about it being integrated with finance capital. You know, it's so complex that this is the criteria in which we're having to operate. For instance, in July, the Bank of England issued a statement about quantitative easing, which really was, appeared to me anyway, to be unofficially the government policy on the economy being presented by the Bank of England. And basically what they were saying, they mentioned housing, they mentioned house prices, and maintaining high house prices was seen as a success, a sign of success of quantitative easing. That was explicitly mentioned in there. So, you know, there's clearly something else going on that isn't just about the physical, getting on with physically building houses. Because if you increase the supply of housing, we're going to see a fall in prices. And that is something, it appears, you have to read between the lines, because nobody's going to tell you this explicitly, that the government doesn't want to see a fall in prices, presumably because there's some equation that some very clever economist has got to look at the situation of the banks and their exposure to a fall in those prices. So, for instance, we're told that you know, we've actually done better than other countries in the financial crisis, because countries like Spain and Ireland, who actually built houses, they're suffering more than we are because they have this great overhang. We haven't done as badly as them. Unfortunately, it seems that we've just put off things that are going to happen to them, because as soon as we start building, presumably there is going to be this problem. I just wanted to mention the other aspect that's come up sort of in the last 6 months, the comparison with the 1930s, where, you know, obviously after the Wall Street crash, you had this fall in prices, which was more, you know, allowed to happen following that, the private sector during the 1930s was building 300,000 homes a year. Was sort of allowed to get on with it. The state did step back and allowed that to happen. And really, when we're talking about a situation like we have today, where not only have people not got anywhere to live, but they haven't got a job now because there's no economic growth. That was clearly on one comparison, the 1930s policy was more successful than the one that we're following today. So obviously you have to nuance that a bit, but there's something to learn from that. And I think the way I would pose it is with the question, why can't a farmer sell their surplus land to a developer just to build a house on? Why is that so difficult a concept for us to envisage?
Okay, over here. I think you're...
When the government threatened to relax the planning rules, I immediately joined CPRE and demanded expansion of the green belts and no building on floodplains or any areas that are risk that are short of water, which includes London. I've seen the drains, you wouldn't want to build there really, or any green space. Now in the 1970s, I was a director of a construction company. We had a visit from the VAT today. And guess what? There's no VAT on new build, which of course builders like greenfield sites. But unfortunately, we can only grow half our food. We cannot support more than 30 million people in this country sustainably. We need some bright innovation, perhaps high rise, but if you're doing it, I want to see some green spaces in it as well, and some trees. We have too many people. I want those every blade of grass protected.
Okay, I'm going to get the panel to come back and to make final comments in a second. We've got about a quarter of an hour. We just want any quick fire, anything else that anybody wants to say. It's got to be kind of pithy and to the point, but if anybody wants to go for it right now, this is your opportunity. Okay.
I just wonder if maybe urbanism is a bit of a red herring. Many more people live in suburbs than inner cities, and that's where people are going to be living in the future. Are we fetishising urbanism?
Okay. Anyone else? Any other quick? Yeah.
It's a bit of a remark to Paul Miner. You talk about our irreplaceable countryside, but as far as I'm concerned, the countryside is always being replaced anyway. An example being where I live. It's a beautiful kind of place, but you can imagine the place being down and industrial at one time because it's all ex-quarries, ex-railways and stuff that was part of the Industrial Revolution, and now it's entirely unnatural. It's all man-made, but nature's taken over. So I don't get the idea that nature is irreplaceable. And perhaps this lady here who talks about every blade of grass being sacred, it seems, this whole lack of vision thing anyway, you get stuff now we've got supposed drought conditions, but huge amounts of rainfall. We need vast amounts of development, infrastructure as well. We need to be building reservoirs and all that kind of thing.
Okay, so if this were a parliamentary select committee, we would deregulate the planning system, wide consensus. We'd get rid of the 47 Town and Country Planning Act. We would invest in massively in infrastructure, and we would focus the government in that direction, and that would unlock innovation. And it would unlock creative design and planning with a small p, would become a creative endeavour. And there seems to be a kind of huge consensus around that in the room, and it's extremely appealing to me. And just it does kind of leave the kind of question, therefore, about why this is not happening. And if anybody wants to kind of talk about what the barriers are to that kind of dream scenario, that could be interesting to hear. But I'd now just like the panel to say any closing comments that you'd like to, starting with you, Daniel.
Yeah, I just had a thought actually, which I could throw at Paul. I think Paul's been a bit battered in this because there hasn't been much sentiment in favour of protecting rural England in the room. It did just strike me, Paul, actually, what you did, I mean, given 1914, something like 50% of the workforce was engaged in agriculture. What you did over the ensuing 30 years was simply export your surplus population to cities, get them into council estates, and then put signs up saying, now we need protection. I mean, maybe what we should be doing is a sort of enforced return of the surplus urban population. Just drive them out into the countryside and let you look after them. And so maybe that's the way we should be going. You could handle the problem out there in the rural parts of England. I don't, of course, mean that seriously in the room. There's a hint of irony in my voice. But it does strike me, of course, in faith, that is actually really what happened. I just want to come back to this idea that I think everyone who's spoken, really, with the exception of this fine lady in the front, whom I have encountered before, I think we met at some other event. Most people in the room, I think, do recognise that we do have some serious problems and we need some radical action to address them. And in this respect, having a coalition government clearly doesn't help, where they can't seem to agree on anything except that they should decide it after the next election. And that's a really depressing and sad place to be.
Okay, thank you. Christy.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about design. There was a question about innovation. That's something that we haven't touched on slightly. I think most of the design innovations, we've kind of thought of them already. You know, this idea of a flat pack home or etc. I think there's a lot to be said for how people would like to live. So not to say that architects can't come up with new ideas for how we live, because we can, but actually there's quite a fixed idea amongst much of the population of how they would like to live, how they picture themselves living. And a lot of that has to do with the size of the home, where it is, how dense it is, whether or not it has a garden, where it's located, how it's connected. And it's just, there are many new developments that are doing innovative things that attract a certain kind of person but don't attract every person. So perhaps there's some thinking to be done about how do we think people in the future in this country, families, you know, what size is the right size, what density is the right density, should we be rethinking what we expect when we have 3 children, what kind of a house that looks like, what kind of a neighborhood that looks like. If it is the current picture, then it has to be a suburb. There's not really another model, I think. The population that actually will accept a kind of tower living with a green space downstairs is not as large as the population that kind of chooses to move out of the city centre when they become a family. So I think just a question about what does it mean to be, you know, a 21st century citizen. Where do you expect to live, and what does that look like? I think it needs some reevaluating amongst the general population.
Okay, thanks, Christy. Paul.
Thank you, Michael. Well, just to sum up from some of the last comments we were talking about, in terms of population, I think the issues of what population this country has or should have in the future go well beyond the concerns of particular environmental groups. It's a much wider political issue that we can't really comment on. But the fact is that if we are having a growing population in this country, then the way that we're going to have any hope of absorbing it is probably by consuming less, because most of the natural resources we have in this world aren't getting any more plentiful. We have to make more sensible use of them. And that does have impacts on how we plan for the future, and it goes back to what I was saying before, that yes, the government's been talking about new garden cities, possibly going back to the garden suburb model, but if we are planning major new cities, then we need to think about making use of land that's already developed. If that's not available, at the very least, we need to be making sure that the new development we're building is zero carbon, and but is also encouraging people to make lifestyle choices which are sustainable in the long run.
Okay.
There's this great picture that Branzi, who I mentioned earlier, produced. I think it's him in the Archizoom, the Italians, from the 70s. And there's a picture of Florence and the Duomo, and you see it, and it's fantastic. We recognise it, we know the skyline. And then there's this great big sort of megastructure that goes all the way up the top of the Duomo along, a bit like Rem Koolhaas's CCTV thing in Beijing. And it's very interesting, because I kind of wish that my students would sometimes be that aggressive in their imagination to produce a similar kind of image, but they don't. If you tell students now of architecture to be radical and imaginative and really get to grips with the problems of the contemporary city, they will design allotments, and they're absolutely obsessed with the idea of introducing allotments and agricultural production into the city. Now that is a really big problem which we are slightly in denial about, I think, because the reality is we could not fall and sort of say, oh, silly old Paul who wants to keep the countryside, but there is a real crisis of imagination at the level of the design profession at the moment. And I suppose that's why I'm trying to sort of say, let's separate those two things out. I would like a double-decker London that is denser, and I would like to see more freedom for development in the countryside. Both of those things are absolutely necessary to resolve the problem, but I wouldn't want to sort of say one is preferable to the other. But I know that the levels of growth in Britain at the moment make that absolutely unlikely to happen. The question is, how do you then create a culture where people can imagine the possibility, regardless of the material conditions that are imposing constraints? Because if people could imagine the possibility at the level of designers, then it might give people a little bit of a kernel of an idea of how we might move forward, and then we can fight politically about the economic questions about whether buildings get procured or not. But if we don't do the design side of it as designers, we're just going to end up with more of contemporary urbanism, which is basically just about trying to sort of control the city and expressing a real anxiety about a sense of loss, and an anxiety about if we do anything radical in the city, there's a danger that we're going to lose the social stability we have. And I'm dead set against that kind of attitude. So I think the new urbanist sort of let's play it safe so we don't get more riots, and let's try and use architecture as a form of social control is very, very dangerous.
Okay, Kelvin.
I agree with that. I also believe that if we think that by dismantling the planning system we're going to solve the problem, and we sit for another 5 or 10 years waiting for it to happen, I think we won't achieve it. I'm rather in favour of evolution rather than revolution. Paul mentioned Freiburg. The German planning system is as rigorous as ours. In fact, there's more legislation. But they just behave differently. They just manage the system differently. A bunch of planners are given freedom to go out and make common sense decisions. They don't follow policy EM4 or policy BC5 or something every minute they look at the plan. And as a result, the mayor of Freiburg will get up and say, well, I don't care. I don't want my guys to go and make sure that guys lose flush properly. I expect people to invest money and time in their own buildings to make sure that they lose do work. So this idea of just a good, sensible dose of common sense needs to work. I think the other thing is that I think we do romanticize high-density urbanism. And the idea that high-density urbanism equals sustainability is also an anathema. Stratford High Street, we are looking at the moment, is a manifestation of high-density going wrong quite badly. And most successful parts of London exist in that sweet spot of about 50 to 150 dwelling units per hectare. The Islingtons of the world, the Kensington, Chelseas. I live in Marylebone at 280 dwelling units per hectare. So this is not high density in terms of high rise. It's actually just good, dense, compact urbanism. And I think that's the message that I'd like to get across. Suburbs is a bad word. Suburbs differentiates good bits of urbanism from bad bits of urbanism. I think we must almost dump that word. Sub meant abnormal in some ways. We don't build suburbia in the way Americans build suburbia. So I mean, I start from the point of view that there's lots we can do with the planning system by just working with it and tweaking it and evolving it over time. I think we do have to have some sensible common sense when it comes to the green belt. There's a kind of an approach that says don't touch, keep cities as static things. Cities are not static. Cities evolve all the time. And therefore our planning must move closer towards a business planning approach than something that effectively says we'll go back and revisit this every 25 years and put a new plan in place, which we know is at the day to day we reduce it.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, could we have a round of applause?